everything you need to know about products and services that can improve your life. This is Experts on Call on CL 650.
Well, welcome back. Here we are at 650 CL StrataLife. I have Dan O'Hearn from QuayPacific Management and Dan Schmidt from Remdale Painting and Paul Mendez from Les Brands Mendez, and we're talking about major constructions, planning and preparing for a major project and major construction. We've just been talking about the pre-contracting phase, when we're actually dealing with specifications, bidding out contracts, whether we're tendering or negotiating with a specific contractor. But getting into the body of the contract, we've actually now, the contract should stipulate how we're going to deal with things like progress payments, for example, who's going to be managing the holdback accounts, and how we're going to be dealing with processing and approval of contracts and work orders that are done. But one of the things that comes up for strata corporations all the time that people fight over a lot is change orders. And, you know, if there's a change order request for something that changes color or design and it wasn't approved by the owners, we know that that can be a bit of a meltdown for a strata because they haven't approved it. The owners were unaware of it, or they didn't consider it. Or a change order that imposes a cost that's way above the scope of what was approved as the original cost. So, Dan, you know, you're in a project. I guess you need clarity, but you also need to know that the person you get authority from actually has that authority to give you a change order.
Very much so. And in fact, we had a job just a year and a half ago where exactly that situation happened, where we were doing additional repairs on the building and had priced those repairs, given quotations for them, had them approved by our contact. And we got to a situation where we're now at a meeting with them, and the strata generally is very upset because that person had been approving them, but they didn't have the broad approval of the rest of the group, or the group wasn't in the loop on the budget. And so the budget had grown, and we'd been upfront with how it was growing, but they hadn't alerted the rest of the group. And that's no fun for anybody. We don't want to be in that situation, and the strata certainly doesn't want to be incurring costs that they weren't expecting. It does begin at the budgeting stages with some contingency budget. I mean, Paul, you talked about, you know, having some allowance for a proper review, not only of the contract, but also along the way, right? There also needs to be the understanding that there's likely to be something that neither side has thought of that's going to come up during a contract, especially if it's sizable, right? And so allowing some sort of contingency budget that the strata has, that they hold, that isn't available without approval to the contractor, but that they can use to deal with some of those change orders, I think takes some of the pressure off of them. And then you mentioned it earlier, what we need to then have is a proper process for it. I don't know, Paul, if there's some requirements on change orders that you recommend to stratas?
Well, certainly it is something. It is something that, thank you, Tony. It is something that you want to think about during the contract review stage, because you know, a change order basically is an amendment to the contract, and your contract has to anticipate how those amendments are going to be made and how they're going to be performed. And that's one of the advantages you can get, again, by using one of the well-recognized standard forms and then having someone review those forms. Where you run into trouble is where that isn't documented. There isn't an understanding of how change orders are going to work, and you end up in a dispute then afterwards over whether this truly is a change, whether it should be, we should be paying more, the costs are out of control. You know, so many variables in the project. Materials that we thought were available might not be available. Oftentimes owners can interfere with the schedule, and we have to work around them, and that working around them may result in a change and needing to be made because an entire elevation has to be missed or moved to a later portion of the contract. Many things can happen, so dealing with change orders in advance, having a procedure set out, only makes good business sense.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things I've seen over the years on projects, and we've seen this through major construction on leaky condos, we've seen it on major roofing projects, is if you have a project where the building system has started to fail, Even today, you know, a 30-year-old townhouse complex with wood siding, and the wood siding has never been treated, painted, or sealed, or dealt with in any way. The older the building product that you're dealing with, and the less rate of performance you're getting out of it, and if it's already causing damage, your contingencies might move from 5 or 10% to 10 to 20 25%, right?
Yeah.
And that's where I think that's where the consumer, the Strata Corporation, needs to start taking advantage and looking at that. And I know, Dan, from manager's perspective, that's the same issue, right?
And people don't necessarily want a budget for the contingencies, especially if you're talking about a 25 or 30% contingency. Well, they're going to feel, well, that's just poor planning on our part, or we didn't get the contractor, sharp enough. The reality is you have to plan for contingency, and it can be returned. If it's not spent, it all goes back to everyone. So it's not money wasted, right? Just because you have a contingency doesn't mean you're spending it.
Right.
But it does open the door, Paul, to a question that strata corporations will struggle with quite often. They budget $100,000 for the job. They didn't build any contingency in it, but then they issue change orders that exceed that value. Right? So how do you deal with that, right? They're now spending money they're not authorized to spend.
That's right. And that can be a problem. I mean, obviously the work needs to be done, but I have been involved in cases where work has gone over budget precisely for this reason. And I'm afraid to say that the people that wear that most often are the council members and the strata manager, because people will say, hey, you know, this wasn't authorized, this wasn't approved. And so very important to always factor in a contingency. I know that people think that if you put a contingency in, it's just going to be spent. In fact, I'm going to say that has not been my experience.
It's not been mine either.
Where a good contingency, where someone has actually thought about this, oftentimes what you're talking about at the end of the project is returning money to the owners. And the question I get from the strata manager is, we have some money to return, but some of the owners have moved. That's a good problem to have.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But just go back to this change order now, because I think it's a critical issue for strata corporations. Who authorizes the change orders? That's an important issue to deal with before this contract starts.
Yeah, if you're using one of the standard forms, there is going to be an owner's representative in the contract, and that is really the person that authorizes. That can be your strata manager if they have the skills to do that. It can be a council member if they have the time and the skills to do it, because most council members are volunteers. And oftentimes it's a project manager, and sometimes it's the engineer if the project has a consultant working on it.
Right.
You know, it should be somebody that is available and has the ability and skill to make those decisions. If I was on a large project, I would be comfortable with a consulting engineer as the advisor, possibly a project manager, depending again on what their skills were.
But now I'm in a fourplex, and I have a $48,000 roof.
Yeah.
And I'm probably not going to hire a project manager for the most part, right? And so who's going to authorize those change orders? The contractor needs to come to someone. And those are the kind of contracts that really create a lot of conflict.
And I think, you know, between the four owners, picking someone to be that owner's representative, you should do that. But then you should have an understanding between the four of you what we're going to do when we're told by the contractor that we need to make a change and the cost is going to go up.
You're right there. Whether it's 4 owners or 400 owners, you got to have the mechanism behind who's got the authority to sign the change order. There has to be a mechanism behind that's granted him that authority. And in a strata corporation, maybe he has to convene with a committee, and maybe if the change is significant enough, it actually has to go to the ownership, right? Well,
and a practice that we've started to see happen, and I think this is coming on now as a result of depreciation reports, and I think this is an excellent practice. As change orders are approved each month, those change orders are minuted in the strata's minutes.
Yeah.
So there's a record of when they were done, who did them, what the value was, and the owners are aware of what's taking place. You know, the communication with the owners is a whole other part of this that we haven't even started to talk about
That's
yet.
an excellent practice, though. And in change orders, there's just to comment on our work in particular. We talked about high-rises or even townhomes or roofing in just a second ago. In all of those, you have places where there are hidden things that you can't know often before the work begins. And the reason is you haven't been right up front with that. So in roofing, typically you're taking off the shingles. Now you need to look underneath that, and there may be damage that needs to be addressed. Certainly on a high-rise building, we might get there. There might be concrete that needs to be repaired, or a rebar that's showing that needs to be addressed, or you talked of siding that, wood repair that might need to get addressed. Some of those things, until you do some of those preparation stages, really haven't become obvious, right? Aren't clear. You might have a likelihood of some. That's that contingency we're talking about. But you don't know what the values of those are. And so one of the ways to deal with that from a contractual basis as a contractor is to ask someone like me to say, okay, if we run into these kind of common things, right, a concrete repair, what kind of rates are you going to charge me, right? Before I sign this contract, how am I going to deal with some of the kind of known unknowns, right? We might want to paint all our exterior suite doors. Can you give me a per door price in case we decide to do that, right? Or what's your hourly rate for wood repair or those kind of things?
Yeah, detailing all the changes is critical. You're listening to Key Pacific's StrataLife in BC. I'm Tony Gioventi, your host, and we'll be right back after these messages.
This is Experts on Call on CIL 650.